Hi everyone. So my name's Emily Green, and I'm working to support the awards for the conference that's taking place in October. And we just wanted to set this time up because the submissions is obviously in full swing at the moment, so with the closing date of the 7th of June. And just wanted to set this time up, and Steve Whiddett has very kindly agreed to help take the session to talk through how to submit an award. And in terms of Steve's been a former judge and is also very generously giving his time again this year to be a judge, so knows his content and what he's looking for extremely well, and has also been a former chair of the APP as well. So during this session, we'd really appreciate it if it could be interactive. So as we go through, if you've got any questions, please fire away. I'm just noticing some typing on the line, so if you're not when you're not talking, when you're not asking questions, I'd really appreciate it if you're able to just mute yourself and then unmute yourself if you have a question that you'd like to ask. That would be great. Thank you. This session is being recorded, so it will be posted on the APP website afterwards as well. So if you'd like to listen to it again, or if you'd like to encourage colleagues or other people that you know to listen to it, and also to just let you know that if you ask any questions or so forth, that will be recorded too. So with that, I'd like to very much hand over to Steve, and thank you very much, Steve, for doing this, and over to you. Okay,
Emily, thank you very much. I'm hoping everybody can hear me okay, and this is my first time running one of these sessions, so bear with me. As Emily said, let's make it interactive, so if you've got any questions, do ask them as we go. This is me, for those who don't know me. Saves you having to look at my face on a video call. And those are the backgrounds that's already been mentioned. I'm still active in terms of consultancy. I'm still a judge for this year as well, so good luck for all those who are making submissions. This is what we're going to be covering. The three parts of the application, what the judge is going to be looking for in terms of ratings, and there's some additional information that's also you can and don't have to provide, which I'll also mention at the end. So we're going to walk through these sections that you need to complete and what the judge is going to be looking for. So there's the application. You've got 3 parts plus the additional information. I will comment that these are not targets, they're limits for the words, and really I would recommend that you use them very wisely. It's not uncommon for me to be reading something where there's a lot of repeated information, which is just a waste of space. If you're going to use these words limits well, you really ought to make sure that each of the sections aims at meeting the criteria that the judge is going to look at. And what I'm going to do in a moment is look at each of these in turn, look at part 1, the challenge, talk about what you need to include in that and what the judge is going to be looking for in that section. So when you're thinking about the application, you need to be thinking about it holistically. You need to be thinking about how information in part 1 might contribute to information elsewhere, but primarily in part 1, you need to make sure that as you describe the challenge, you're thinking about what the judges will assess in part 1, similarly in part 2. And I'll go through that in some detail. So we'll look at each section and the judging in turn. Part 1 is the challenge. This is information that you should have available to you. It's certainly downloadable from the ABP website. I just want to clarify some of the points on there, so I'll give you a moment to just browse that. So 400 words. Those points at the bottom, you need to provide evidence of relevance to business and stakeholder engagement. Whatever you write in this section, write it with those things in mind. That's what the judge is going to be looking at. So the first bullet point under the first section there, what was the opportunity challenge that prompted this business psychology intervention? What was your work? I'm frequently seeing applications, well, not hugely because they are getting better. There are times when I'm looking at applications and they're basically saying this is what the client wanted and this is what we did. That is not what we're going to be looking for. What we're going to be looking for is this is what the client needed. whether or not that's what they asked for. This is what they needed. This is how we established that need. And this is what we did to meet that need. So you should be providing evidence that links business psychology to that business need. Not just these are the tools we used. If you've got a very popular or favorite instrument that you use, that's a tool for meeting the need. That's not the thing itself. That's not business psychology. That's just one of the things you use to implement it. And try and make that clear in this section. And then the third part in there, describe how you achieved this, not just what you did. So how did you go about doing it? How did you engage stakeholders? Not we ran some workshops or we provided information on a regular basis. Think about how did you make sure that they understood, that you brought them into the process, you engaged with the stakeholders. Is there some questions waiting there? I can hear something. Okay, so your 400 words must focus on these 2 points, what the judges are looking for, relevance to business and stakeholder engagement. The judges can't assume that you must have done or known something if you don't mention it. Okay? So this is, the judges have rating forms, and the ratings are broken up into the sections that we're going through. So when I'm looking at an application, I want to primarily find the information about the challenge in that section. Clearly there will be other information about the challenge in other sections as well, but most of it I would expect to find in this section. And this is how it's rated. So this is really quite important information. You need to be thinking about, if you were sitting down rating your contribution, where would you fall in these boxes? So this is what the judges are looking for, and they rate it accordingly. So excellence in doing what you're asked to do does not mean that it's relevant. You've got to show that it's relevant. So minimum evidence of understanding or addressing the business challenge, this is the box on the top left. Limited evidence of or incorrect understanding, limited evidence that the project addresses the issue. That's not uncommon. Quite often people will want to say what they've done but not make that link. Why was it important for this business? And so on. You can see the strong evidence here is of understanding and effectively addressing the business challenge. So when you're describing the what it was you were doing, you need to relate it to the business challenge all the way through. Clearly state, I did this because it fitted this need. This is how we were going to address this need. And stakeholder engagement, probably the easiest way of getting a good score on this, and I'll be very upfront, is to describe it as a process. It's not a series of events. It's not a series of actions. It's very easy to think, okay, yeah, no, we had regular meetings with stakeholders and we've kept them up to date with what we were doing. That's informing. That's not engaging. Okay, how did you bring them on board with the process? How did you bring them on board with the methods that you chose? What did you do? How regularly did you meet? How did you address challenges? Was there pushback? If there was pushback, how did you overcome it? I hope I'm not going too quickly. If you've got any questions, do ask. Any questions there? Stunning silence. Okay. I'm going to go on to the next section then, which is the approach. I'll slow down a little bit now because this is the format that I'm going to take right through this section. So we're going to look at the approach, look at the guidance points that you've been given for that, and then we go and look at what the raters are going to be looking for, what the judges are looking for. So here's the approach. So here, really looking ideally for you to be able to describe improvements that you made for all that were involved. So improvements for the business and improvements for the individuals. What did you do to improve or enhance the outcomes experienced by those involved? And that could be indirectly as well as directly. So you may be looking at a project which is to do with organizational effectiveness, and then you might also talk about how individuals within the organizations benefited as well as maybe clients benefited from that, or your client organization's customers benefited from those improvements. So consider all the stakeholders and how you managed that's the within organization stakeholders as well. Project execution really covers aspects of project planning. So you should be looking at what the objectives were, how you set out milestones, what you did to monitor and measure milestones, what you did to monitor and measure objectives. Second bullet point on that page, which approaches we use to enhance your outcome and delivery value to your audience. These should be tied into psychological theories and methods, not just the tools you used. Remember, psychometric tools does not equal doing business psychology. Business psychology is about choosing the right methods and applying the right methods and techniques to specific business-based issues, using psychological theories to do it. So some of the best applications I've seen that meet this criteria very, very well will simply list the key theories that influenced the approach, how they were used to decide what the interventions would be, what instruments and methods they would use, and how they then use them within the organization. Third part on there is about expectations. What expectations were there regarding how the quality and success of the project was to be measured? So you're looking here at expected outcomes, and therefore, in effect, not in effect, in practice, you really want to be talking a priori measures. So you need to be saying, at the beginning of the project, we set up a set of expectations and how we would measure them, because later in your application, you need to talk about the evaluation. There should be a clear link between what you set out to achieve, the measures that you anticipated using, the measures you eventually did use, and the results that you came up with. Okay, again, the 2 bullet points at the bottom here, these here are things you need to keep in mind when you're doing your application at this stage. So these 600 words really want to focus on applying psychological theory and practice and effective project execution. What the judges are looking for within those 600 words are these 2 areas that are being rated, or that would be rated here. So from low relevance to psychological theory to strong evidence of applying appropriate psychological theory. And as I said before, you can't assume that the judges will make links for you. If you choose a tool or technique, state why. What's the theory that underpinned it? And how does that theory tie that application back, or that technique back, to what you were trying to achieve and what the business need was? Keep a thread through this. This is what we set out. This was the need. This is what we set out to do. These are the techniques we used. These are the theories or models that informed that choice, and this is how we used them. These were the outcomes. Project evaluation or project execution is assessed later. Sorry, project evaluation is assessed later, but you do need to show that your journey toward it, and that's part of what this effective project execution rating can help with. If you do not have or don't show expected outcomes or objectives, there is very little you're likely to be able to do to support an effective project execution. So you need to be stating clearly what it was you set out to achieve, what the milestones were. If you use the project plan, just pick out the key points, key stages. If you if you designed your expectations or wrote your expectations in terms of goals, expected outcomes, then state them here in this section. Again, it's useful to be able to relate those back to the need and the expected outcome, and how that fits with the theories that you are using to inform this approach. Looks like at this stage we're going to have a lot of questions at the end, hopefully. None coming through at the moment? Okay, then I'm going to go on. outcome evaluation. Expected outcomes versus actual outcomes. That's what we're looking at. So here, how did you demonstrate that you had met your objectives, illustrating the quality, value, and or success of the work? Occasionally, I have seen submissions which talk about outcomes and very strong claims made for those outcomes, i.e. that we were responsible for doing it because of our project, and yet those outcomes had no relation to any objectives that were mentioned at the beginning of the work. So you do need to keep it consistent. State what you're trying to do at the beginning and what measures you're going to have in place to measure your objectives. And at this point, you need to be stating clearly what measures you've used, how you gathered that information, and how you used it to support your assertion that your objectives were met or partially met. So where they're quantifiable, state what the measures are and state what the changes were that took place. Ideally pre and post. So this is what it's like when we started. This is what it's like when we completed our intervention. What learning did you derive from this work? So show any insights that you had that would improve your future effectiveness. This is not asking for you to necessarily own up to errors. It's actually saying, what did you learn from the work? Is there something you do differently, or would you would do to enhance any future work of this type? Because what you're trying to display here is improving your overall effectiveness and learning. On the third bullet point there, how can you rule out other explanations for the outcomes you observed? Could these results be due to other actions? State what it was that you controlled for or could not control for. Again, it's really disappointing to read a very strong application that gets to here and makes the assertion that this is what our intervention created this outcome, and yet there are so many other things going on. A very good example of this is where there's some intervention relating to change, and it's part of a much larger change program, and yet there's nothing in the submission that indicates that the other change activities are being accounted for in this work. So there's no way of understanding what actually had or made the difference. Where you can, try to be clear about this intervention was specifically targeted at this particular issue. This is what we were trying to achieve. This is how we achieved it. And if possible, this is what we could control for and did. This is how we controlled for it. Here are some things we would like to have controlled for but couldn't and didn't. That's okay. The world's like that. It's a bit of a messy place. If the evaluation, so down here, these are the things you need to have in mind while you're writing this section. So 500 words, you're looking at focusing in on the effective evaluation and the extent of the impact. In terms of effective evaluation, some interventions may have, in terms of how you've planned it, it may be that the evaluation is a longer or ongoing process. If it is, state that. Say that it's an ongoing process. State what measures you've got in place, and if possible, provide any interim results. So you can again show that it's on that journey and you've still got control over this. In terms of the impact on the business and the people affected by this work, it can be a very big claim to make. One of the big challenges, I think, for any work in this area is being absolutely clear that this outcome or the impact of this was due to this intervention. It's very difficult to make that statement with 100%. You're never going to get that level of confidence. You do need, and it would be really helpful, to try and work out what level of confidence you can have in making such a claim. And that, as I say, that means having a better understanding of the wider business activities that are going on during this intervention. I hope that's clear. Right, we're getting near to the end of the slide bits, and I'm going to go on to the Q&A soon. But there are a couple of other things. Let's go on to the what the judges are going to be rating in terms of outcome evaluation. So as I said, the first bit is effective evaluation. That needs to be as objective as you can make it. So evidence means just that. It needs to be factual, not just based on what people liked or felt. Quite often, I've seen submissions which talk about workshops that managers have been involved in, and part of the evaluation, or in fact sometimes the majority of the evaluation, is based on they loved it and despite not wanting to go on it, and they've encouraged their colleagues to go on it. That's not an evaluation. That's a perception. It's how effective was that workshop in changing the attitudes and behaviors of individuals, if that was the objective to do. That's the bit that needs to be assessed, not how people liked it. Happy sheets really don't cut it when it comes to project evaluation. So it's not just what people liked or felt. Measures must relate to the expected outcomes and objectives. They must show some sort of positive movement. So you need to be able to say, as I said before, when we started, let's take something like how people feel they're being treated at work in terms of respect and dignity, for example. If you've got a pre-measure of that from some survey, then at this point you should be saying, we reran that survey X number of months after or years after the original survey, after our intervention, and the score went from X to Y. This is the level of improvement that we were expecting, and we made it, or we got close to it, or we exceeded it. That's the sort of stuff that needs to be going in here. If it's looking at organizational effectiveness, then you need to have some sort of measure of efficiency at the beginning, and a new or a revised figure against that same measure at the end of the intervention. Try to use, if you have a number of objectives, think about evaluation methods that fit the different objectives. That may mean that you've got a number of different evaluation methods, therefore a range of data and different outcomes for different objectives. Simple way of doing that, put them into a matrix. Just show that you've got all this data. You don't need to use loads and loads of text to describe data. Data's pretty easy to summarize and present visually. So think about efficient ways of presenting that information. In terms of impact on the business, or there's also this category about impact in society. I'll stick to the business one for the moment. In terms of impact on the business and its people, there should be a desired and expected change that you need to show was brought about by your work. And that's, as I said before, it can be difficult, but if you start off thinking about this as writing a story that has a journey, a beginning and end, from a need to a fulfillment, it's much easier to make that assertion. But also, as I say, you do need to take account of other changes in place or other programs in place in the organization or around the organization at the time of your intervention. Okay, I hope that's fairly clear. There's a lot of information here. There is an additional rating that judges are asked to provide, and that's for innovation. Now, there's no specific guidance in the preceding notes on innovation, but bear in mind that it will be assessed, and it contributes to a separate award, irrespective of the category to which you're submitting. Okay, so this may or may not be of interest to you, but it is something that the judges will be looking for, and they will provide a rating against. And finally, final slide. You can include up to a page of visual or graphic material, and this is almost I'd say it's to illustrate something that you want to raise in your submission, but it is to illustrate it. It's not to replace or add to it the understanding, other than a good example of this, I suppose, would be a graphic of a model, or a timeline plan for your project plan. So it illustrates something you've already described. If a good way of considering whether this needs to be included or not is if it adds value, then that's good. But if the text that you have can only really be fully understood with this, then it probably is wrong. The text needs to be beefed up. So the text of your submission, the 3 sections that you submit, that's where your detailed understanding, detailed description should be. This is something that you might want to include just to add an illumination or an illustration. Yep, I'd say a graph or an image, a model that's better understood visually. That's the sort of thing you can include here. And finally, the acknowledgements, pretty much self-explanatory. This is about additional contributors, contributors that are not necessarily directly involved in the delivery of the work. So the project team you would have included in the submission, whereas this is going to be maybe people who are working behind the scenes, or individuals who influenced the design, maybe people you've used as advisors that you want to recognize. This is a place where you can place their names. And if you've used any really influential models, things that you felt this project really relied on this particular theoretical view, again, this is a place where you can list those influences, the individuals behind those theories. And that's it in terms of the slides. What I'd like to do now, given there hasn't been any questions, maybe it's because I'm going too quickly or there's too much information. If you want to digest that for a moment, and then we can deal with some questions.
Thank you very much, Steve. That was really helpful. So if anyone wants to unmute themselves and ask a question, please do. And equally, if you would prefer not to speak it, but would like to type it into the chat, please go ahead and do that, and I can read it out for the group.
That would be helpful, thank you.
Hi there, it's Ben. Thanks, Steve, very
Hi,
much
Ben.
for that. Thank you very much for that. Really insightful. I had one question as obviously a member of the judging panel in recent years. I'd be really interested if you could point us to any sort of anything that sticks out in your mind in terms of really notable previous award winners, or anything from a sort of case study point of view that we could kind of look to for an example of sort of where an application has been done really well, and sort of obviously bringing to life a lot of the kind of criteria and stuff you've just taken us through. That'd be really useful.
The one that stood out for me actually most was Maggie Mosley, who I think ran this section last year. I did rate one of her pieces of work, but it was notable that she won, I think, 3 awards in 1 year.
Okay.
And the quality of the submissions was really quite noticeably different from the competitors at that time. For example, in the challenge, there was a very clear list of specific issues that the organisation had raised on the particular. I think it was an organisational change one that I was working on, or performance improvement one. There was a list of specific organisational challenges, and against each of those, there was a very clear understanding of what theoretical issues are likely to be influencing it and what needed to be taken account of. Those were then used to identify the methods for intervention. The objectives were clearly laid out with measures for what success would look like. And then as you went through the submission, as you went through each bit, they were all linked together. So that was the challenge part. You went into the approach. The approach elaborated on the extent to which the theories and methods in part one were then employed and used to keep the organization involved. There was a lot of stuff in there as well around actively engaging the stakeholders. So the stakeholders were improved in jointly developing the approach within the organization. So the method, I don't have the specifics to hand, so I'm working from memory, and bear with me, my memory is getting a bit faded. But the theory informed the method, but the method itself, the detail of the method and how that was going to be implemented was very much done with a group of people who were going to be affected by this intervention. So they could shape it, and that was described in the approach. And when it came to the evaluation, the outcome evaluation, it was very easy to actually rate that section because the objectives were there right from the beginning. The measures were there right at the beginning, and you could then link it right the way through and say, okay, well, that's where it started. That's what it looked like when it started. This is what it looked like at the end of the intervention, and this is how the things fitted together. The impact area was also, I think, was pretty good as well. But I've always found that one quite a difficult one to give a very high rating to, because there are always some extraneous circumstances that you cannot control for. But in those submissions, there were some very strong arguments as to why the particular interventions were the ones which had some impact. A degree of impact was claimed, but not the total impact. Is that helpful, Ben? I know that's
that is, yes, thank you.